The air smelled like dust and something metallic, not blood but like worn gears. Old machinery mostly. It wasn't unpleasant, just present. The pumping station wasn't what I expected. I'd pictured something sleek and modern, all chrome and blinking lights. This was functional. Brutalist, almost concrete block, low ceilings, pipes running everywhere like veins under skin. I'd filled out the application online, hadn't even seen the place in person until today. Desperation does things to your standards. $20,000 still loomed over us, Sarah's bills, and even with the insurance this job offered, it felt like treading water. Old Man Hemlock, the guy I was replacing, barely acknowledged me. Just shoved a ring of keys into my hand, pointed towards a chipped Formica desk, and said, "Rules are there. Shift starts now." Then he was gone, swallowed by the gloom of the access road. No explanation, no good luck, not even a grunt, just gone. The desk was covered in a thin layer of grime. On top of a stack of logbooks was a manila folder, secured with a single paperclip. I flipped it open. Inside were 8 sheets of paper, typed on what had to be a 30-year-old typewriter. Each sheet had a single rule, numbered. I read the first one aloud, mostly to break the silence. Do not whistle, hum, or sing anywhere on the premises. If you hear anyone doing so, leave the area immediately. What? Seriously? An anti-tune policy? I chuckled, a short, dry sound. Okay, Hemlock had a weird sense of humor. The second rule: if unseasonable warmth occurs outside, do not open any exterior door or window until it passes. It was October. Unseasonable warmth wasn't exactly a common concern in upstate New York. I glanced out the small barred window, overcast, gray, a definite chill in the air. Still, you never knew. Rule 3 was stranger. Do not tell anyone your real name. Do not use anyone else's name aloud. Do not answer if your name is called. I frowned. That was unsettling. Paranoid even. I ran my tongue over my teeth. Kieran O'Connell, I hadn't thought about saying my name out loud all day. Felt odd to actively not think about it. If the lights go out, stay exactly where you are. Do not use a flashlight or your phone light. Wait for them to come back on. Rule 4. Sensible in a way. Safety protocol, except it felt absolute. No exceptions, no checking on things, just wait. I kept going. If you hear something dragging across linoleum, do not investigate. Leave the area immediately. I pictured the long, empty hallways. Linoleum. Of course, this place was all about the linoleum. At exactly 11:17 p.m., perform 10 jumping jacks for exactly 60 seconds. Do not skip it. I stared at the paper. 10 jumping jacks? Hemlock was definitely messing with me. Or maybe it was a weird team-building exercise I hadn't been informed about. I suppressed a laugh. Sarah would get a kick out of this. Rule 7. If you hear breathing that is not your own in an empty room, do not hold your breath. Breathe normally and leave at a normal pace. That was genuinely creepy. I shivered despite myself. I told myself it was the draft from under the door. It was probably just a poorly worded safety instruction. Something about checking for gas leaks. The last one. If you detect the smell of burnt hair anywhere on the premises, move upwind immediately. Do not try to identify the source. Burnt hair. That was specific, and deeply unpleasant to imagine. I reread the whole list. Slowly. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. The sheer specificity, the lack of explanation, it was unsettling. But still, it was probably just some eccentric old-timer leaving his mark. A final weird prank. I folded the rules back into the manila folder, setting it aside. I had a shift to start. The monitors were old, cathode ray tubes, flickering slightly. They showed feeds from security cameras positioned around the perimeter of the site, the gas compressors, the storage tanks, the fence line. Everything looked normal, quiet. The only sound was the low thrum of the machinery, a constant vibrating hum that settled in your chest. I checked my watch. 8:03 p.m. Long night ahead. I reached for a lukewarm coffee in a styrofoam cup Hemlock had left on the desk. It tasted like regret. I glanced back at the folder. The rules. I found myself unconsciously straightening the edge of the paper, smoothing out a crease. Just to do something, I guess. But as I did, I noticed something. A small handwritten note tucked under the last rule. It was just one word, scrawled in faded ink. Remember. I didn't like the way that felt. I checked the watch again. 8:05. The air in the room felt colder than it had a few minutes ago. I reached for the thermostat, then stopped. Maybe I was just imagining things. I was logging the pressure readings from compressor unit 3. It was tedious, really. Every 15 minutes, I'd write down the numbers from the digital display in a logbook. Hemlock hadn't bothered to update the system to automatic recording. He said it was too reliant on technology. The man was a walking anachronism. The numbers didn't fluctuate much. A steady 85 dpsi, sometimes dipping to 848, occasionally creeping up to 852. It was the kind of job where your eyes started to blur and your brain felt like cotton. I tried to focus on the little things, the way the fluorescent lights flickered, the dust motes dancing in the beam, the faint smell of oil and metal. Anything to stay awake. I'd been thinking about Sarah, about the bills piling up. The hospital had sent another notice. $20,000. It felt insurmountable. The insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. I'd already taken out a second loan against the house. It was a constant weight, pressing down on me. I was listening to static crackle on the shortwave radio, trying to pick up a signal from somewhere, anywhere, just to hear a human voice that wasn't my own, or the hum of the compressors. And then, without thinking, I started to hum. It was just a little tune, something my mother used to sing to me when I was a kid. A simple melody, barely audible even to myself. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I felt a vibration. Not in the floor, not in the walls, but in my teeth. A high-pitched, almost inaudible resonance that made my gums ache. I stopped humming immediately. The vibration ceased. I blinked, trying to figure out what had happened. Maybe it was just fatigue. My sinuses were a little congested. I'd been breathing recirculated air for hours. It could have been some kind of sympathetic vibration from the machinery. The compressors were powerful, after all. I went back to logging the pressure. 851 psi, still steady. But the feeling lingered. That resonance. It wasn't a sound I'd ever experienced before. It wasn't painful, exactly, but profoundly unsettling. Like something inside me was responding to something outside me. Then I heard it, faint, but distinct, a whistling. Not from the machinery, not the wind, a human whistle, a simple two-note tune. It was coming from somewhere outside, somewhere beyond the perimeter fence. My stomach tightened. I scanned the monitor feeds, nothing. The cameras showed only empty fields, the fence line, the dark silhouette of the trees in the distance, but the whistling continued, clearer now, closer. Almost inside the room with me. That's when it hit me, the rules. I flipped through the manila folder, my hands surprisingly unsteady. I skimmed the pages, trying to find it. Something about sounds, something about not making sounds. It was buried somewhere in the middle. I remembered a feeling, a vague sense of dread associated with a specific instruction, something about not whistling, humming, or singing. And if you heard someone else doing it, you had to leave, immediately. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the gist was there, imprinted on my brain somehow. I glanced at the door. It was 20 yards down the hall to the break room. 20 yards to safety, but leaving meant abandoning my post, leaving the monitors unattended. Hemlock had been very specific about that. Never leave the monitors unattended, no matter what. And I was already behind on the compressor logs. But the whistling was getting louder, and that vibration, it was starting again. A faint tingling in my teeth, intensifying with each note. I hesitated for only a moment longer. I grabbed the logbook, the pen, and quickly logged 851 psi. A quick, frantic scribble. Then I walked, quickly but deliberately, towards the door, trying to appear calm, to move at a normal pace, like nothing was wrong. As I reached the doorway, I risked a quick glance towards the fence line. The security camera feed showed nothing, just darkness, But the whistling was now incredibly loud, almost deafening, and something felt different. The air was thicker, colder. The vibration had spread to my jaw, making my teeth ache. I stepped through the door and kept walking towards the break room. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The break room was empty, thankfully. I slumped into a chair, trying to catch my breath. The whistling faded slightly, but the vibration persisted. It was still there, buzzing in my skull. I sat for a long time, just listening, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the whistling stopped, the vibration subsided. The air felt normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had noticed me. I checked my watch. 8:32 p.m. An hour and a half had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. I knew I couldn't dismiss the rules as a joke anymore. They were real, and they mattered. I just didn't know why. I went back to the monitoring station, the logbook now feeling heavy in my hand. I logged the time. 8:32 p.m., compressor unit 3, 851 psi. It felt like a small act of defiance, or maybe just a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control. I would never hum again while on this job. I knew that much, and I had a feeling, a cold, sinking feeling, that this was just the beginning. The overnight shift was mostly logging readings. Every 15 minutes I'd walk the line, checking the gauges on each of the 6 compressors, unit 1 through 6, then back to 3. The pattern was ingrained already after 2 weeks. It was boring, sure, but it paid the bills, and the health insurance was it was a lifeline. Maria's medication wasn't cheap. I'd brought a thermos of coffee, strong and black, and was nursing it slowly, trying to stretch it out. It was a little past midnight. Compressor Unit 5 was running steady at 920 psi. The hum of the machinery was a constant companion, a low thrumming that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into my legs. I made a note in the logbook, the pen scratching against the paper. Outside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't the usual wind whistling through the scrub brush. It was just stillness. I moved on to Unit 6. Another check, another entry, and then I noticed it. The air. It felt thick, not humid exactly, just heavy, like trying to breathe through cotton. I glanced out the small, grimy window. That's when I saw it. Or rather, didn't see it. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, but the visibility was dropping. Not in the way fog rolls in, but differently. It was like the darkness was expanding, creeping across the landscape. Everything beyond 50 feet was blurred, indistinct. I frowned. It wasn't fog. It was January in Oklahoma. Fog wasn't this sharp, this absolute. It was more like a lack of light, a diminishing of definition. I checked the weather app on my phone. Clear skies, 28 degrees. Wind, calm. That was odd. Dead calm was unusual for this area. We always had some breeze, even a slight one. I finished my rounds, checking units 1, 2, and 3. The feeling of unease persisted. The air felt heavier with each step. I started to feel a slight pressure in my ears, like when you're ascending in an airplane. I dismissed it as fatigue. It had been a long week, juggling shifts with doctor's appointments for Maria. I was probably just tired. But then a memory flickered at the edge of my mind. Something about conditions, about not opening doors. It wasn't a clear recollection, more a feeling, a fragment of a sentence, something old Man Hemlock had written down, something about the weather, something about not letting something in. I racked my brain, trying to remember the exact wording. It was buried somewhere in that stack of papers he'd left me, the ones filled with all those strange rules. There was something about specific conditions, about staying inside, about not inviting anything in when the air changed. I went back to the security monitors. The feed from the perimeter cameras showed nothing but the encroaching darkness. The fence line was barely visible now, and then I heard a scraping sound, faint but distinct, coming from outside the main building, like something dragging against the gravel. My breath hitched. I remembered then not the exact words, but the feeling of dread that had washed over me when I first read it. The rule. Whatever it was, it concerned the weather, it concerned staying inside. I couldn't remember the specifics, but the feeling was enough. Don't open the doors, don't go outside. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, and then a new sound joined it. A low, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat. Slow. Deliberate. I needed to check the perimeter. Protocol dictated a full scan if any alarm was triggered, or if there was any sign of intrusion. I hesitated, hand hovering over the door release. My gut twisted. This wasn't an intrusion, it was something else. Something the rule warned against. But the fence line was down near Unit 4, and the reports have been coming in the last few weeks about copper theft. I needed to see if the perimeter was breached. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand clammy. The thudding continued, steady and unsettling. I forced myself to remember, to recall the feeling of the rule, the sense of containment. Don't open the door, the air, the stillness, and then a clearer memory, something about not inviting it in. It was a vague recollection, but it was enough. I lowered my hand, I stayed put, I checked the security monitors again. The thudding was louder now, the scraping more insistent. The darkness pressed closer, blurring the images on the screen. I sat there for 2 hours, listening, watching, waiting. The thudding and scraping eventually stopped. The darkness began to recede, slowly, reluctantly. By sunrise, the air felt normal again, the visibility restored. I logged the events, omitting any mention of the strange conditions or my internal struggle. Just a standard report, perimeter check deferred due to adverse weather conditions. I still don't know what was out there, but I know this. I will never ignore those rules again. I will never dismiss a feeling, no matter how irrational it seems, and I will never ever open that door again when the air feels like that. I'm starting to think there's a reason Hemlock left those papers, a reason he disappeared, and I'm starting to think it's a reason I'm going to regret not understanding sooner. The overnight shift wasn't always bad. Sometimes it was peaceful. Tonight was one of those nights. I was running a diagnostic on Unit 7, checking the pressure sensors and flow rates. It's a repetitive job, really. Mostly just watching numbers shift on a screen, but I'd rigged up a little shortwave receiver to run alongside it. Mostly static, but occasionally you'd catch a snatch of a broadcast, a voice from somewhere far away. It was a way to feel less isolated, I guess. The station itself is pretty straightforward. 6 compressor units arranged in a circle around the main control room. Each unit hums with a different pitch, a low thrum that vibrates through the floor. Unit 7 was always the loudest, the most insistent. I'd adjusted the sensitivity on the sensors a few times, trying to get a clean reading, but the vibrations kept throwing everything off. It was frustrating, but not urgent. Just another thing on the list. I'd finished the initial run-through, verifying the baseline readings, and was about to start on the secondary systems when I heard it. A voice, clear as day. "Kieran?" I froze, the voice. It was my wife, Sarah. But it couldn't be. She's almost 2 hours away recovering at her sister's. And even if she wasn't, she wouldn't be here. She hates this place. She says it smells like, well, she says it smells like nothing good. I glanced at the security monitors. Nothing. Just the empty yard, the chain link fence, the dark expanse of the fields beyond. "Kieran, is that you?" The voice was closer now, right behind me, and it was undeniably her. The same inflection, the same little catch in her throat when she's asking a serious question. I slowly turned around. Nothing. The control room was empty, just the blinking lights of the monitors, the steady hum of the compressors. My first thought was a prank, one of the day crew messing with me. But it sounded too real, too personal. They wouldn't know to use her voice. It was unsettling, but I figured it was probably just fatigue. These long nights do things to your head. I shook it off, telling myself I needed to get more sleep. Then, a flicker of something at the back of my mind. A feeling. A rule. Something about names. Not saying your name. Not letting anyone say your name. It wasn't a clear memory, more like a half-remembered dream. Something Hemlock had written, tucked away amongst all the other oddities. Something about ownership, about giving something a claim. I couldn't recall the exact wording. "Kieran, it's me. I need to talk to you." This time, the voice was right in my ear. I jumped, spinning around again, knocking over my coffee mug. Black liquid splattered across the console. I stared at the mess, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Not a panic, not yet, more like a deep, cold dread settling in my stomach. I wiped at the spill with a paper towel, trying to regain some composure. I remembered Hemlock's face, the way he'd looked at me when handing over the keys, a mix of weariness and fear. And then I remembered the feeling associated with the rule, the sheer weight of it. Don't answer. Don't acknowledge it. I bit the inside of my cheek. Hard. It was a reflex, a way to ground myself. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight. I wanted to call out, to ask what was going on, to confirm it was really her, but I couldn't, I shouldn't. The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Kieran, please, just say something." I forced myself to look away from where the voice seemed to be coming from, focusing on the flickering numbers on the Unit 7 display. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into the palms of my hands. It hurt, a sharp grounding pain. I didn't say a word. The voice didn't stop. It continued for what felt like an eternity, repeating my name, asking questions, expressing concern. Each repetition felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The humming of Unit 7 seemed to grow louder, resonating in my skull. I hadn't realized how much I relied on it to mask other sounds. Finally, after what felt like hours, the voice faded away. Not abruptly, but slowly, like a radio signal losing strength. The humming of Unit 7 returned to a normal level. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I sat there for a long time, staring at the Unit 7 display, my hands still clenched. I didn't check the security monitors. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening. I'm not sure how long it was. I don't think I could have stood it if I'd tried to measure it. I finished the diagnostic on Unit 7. A slow, deliberate process. Each step taken with painstaking care. Then I logged the results, noting only the sensor readings and the flow rates. I didn't mention the voice. I didn't mention the fear. I didn't mention the rule. I'll never answer if someone calls my name here. I won't even look. The thought of it makes my teeth ache, a dull, persistent throb, and I keep glancing at my wife's picture on the dashboard, wondering if I'm starting to forget the sound of her real voice. I'm starting to think Hemlock wasn't just some crazy old man, and I'm starting to think this job is going to cost me more than just my sleep. I was checking the pressure gauges on the south line. Routine stuff, each pump had 3 of them, a low, a medium, and a high-pressure readout, all digital, glowing that sickly green. I'd walk the line, comparing the readings to the log from the previous shift, looking for anything that drifted outside the acceptable range. Mostly, it was just tedious. It gave me something to do, though, something that didn't involve staring at the screens or thinking about bills. Old Man Hemlock, the guy who trained me, used to say the gauges told you everything you needed to know. "The gas tells the truth, Kieran," he'd rasp, reeking of pipe tobacco. "Don't trust anything but the gauges." He was a strange one, Hemlock, full of those folksy sayings and cryptic warnings. I always figured it was just a way to feel important. Now I wasn't so sure. I scribbled the readings into my notepad. Unit 4 was holding steady. Unit 5 was 1/10 of a PSI low on the medium pressure gauge. Nothing to worry about, just a minor fluctuation. I made a note to check it again on my next pass. In an hour or so. The air in the pump house was thick and stale, smelling of oil and something metallic, like old pennies. It never really bothered me, not after a while. Outside, the stillness was remarkable. I glanced towards the security camera feed on my wrist-mounted display. Nothing moving. No wind, no rain, no clouds. Just nothing. It was a type of quiet that always unsettled me. That feeling that something should be happening, but wasn't. It reminded me of being a kid and waking up in the middle of the night and knowing something was wrong, even before you could put your finger on it. I finished Unit 5 and started on Unit 6. The readings were all normal, the numbers glowing green in the dim light. I was just about to move on to Unit 7 when it happened. The lights flickered. Just a quick blink, almost imperceptible. I'd seen it before, a brownout from the grid. It happens sometimes, especially during storms, although like I said, It wasn't storming. I was reaching for my radio to report it, part of the protocol, when the lights went out completely. Complete, utter darkness. My hand froze mid-air. The sudden blackness was disorienting. I blinked, trying to adjust, but there was nothing to adjust to. Just nothing. I instinctively reached for my phone in my pocket. It had a decent flashlight. I started to pull it out, and that's when something clicked. A half-remembered phrase, a vague sense of dread. Something about the lights? Something about not moving? It wasn't a clear memory, more of a feeling, like a dream you can't quite grasp when you wake up, a warning. Old Man Hemlock, maybe, or something from that document they made me sign on my first day. The one full of legalese and strange clauses, I couldn't remember exactly, but the gist of it was, don't use lights when the power fails. I stopped, my hand still in my pocket, gripping my phone. It felt stupid, incredibly stupid. Here I was in the dark, in a potentially dangerous situation, and I was hesitating because of some half-remembered rule from a crazy old man and a stupid document. Probably just a safety precaution, designed to prevent tripping hazards or something. I took a deep breath, telling myself to be rational. The emergency generators should kick in any second. It was probably just a momentary glitch. But the seconds ticked by, and the silence remained absolute. No hum of generators, no flickering emergency lights, just darkness. My pulse quickened. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I forced myself to lower my hand and let my phone drop back into my pocket. My stomach churned. I stood there, completely still, straining my ears, listening for any sound, anything. But there was only silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence. It felt like an eternity. Minutes stretched into a timeless void. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Then, I thought I heard something, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the concrete floor. It was distant, barely audible, but it was there. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint glow of the Unit 7 display, straining to see something, anything, in the darkness. The scraping sound came again. Closer this time, it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. After a while, the lights flickered back on. Not a bright, reassuring illumination, but a dim, sickly yellow. The pumps hummed back to life, the gauges glowing green once more. Everything looked exactly as it had before, except it wasn't. I stood there, my legs trembling, my chest heaving. I didn't immediately check the gauges. I didn't immediately log the power outage. I just stood there, listening to the hum of the machinery, trying to slow my breathing. I felt violated, like something had been close, too close. I looked around the pump house, scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of what had made those sounds. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. When I finally checked my notepad, the readings for Unit 6 were different than what I'd written. The medium pressure gauge now read 5 psi lower, a significant drop. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't moved from where I stood when the lights went out. I logged the change, a cold dread settling in my stomach. I'm going to have to triple-check everything for the rest of my shift. I'm going to have to pretend this never happened, and I'm absolutely positively never going to reach for my phone when the lights go out again. I still don't know what that was, or what effect my staying still had, but I know now the document wasn't just legalese, and I know Old Man Hemlock wasn't just a crazy man. This isn't about safety. It's about something else, something I don't want to understand. I spent the first 2 hours of the shift doing the pressure checks on the pipeline. It's the most boring part of the job, honestly. Walking the length of the line, clipboard in hand, scribbling down numbers, making sure everything's holding steady. It's mostly just walking, and the quiet gets to you after a while, especially with this stillness. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath tonight. I double-checked the forecast before I left, and it was supposed to be clear, but the air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down. Unit 9 was giving me a little trouble. The low-pressure gauge was fluctuating, drifting up and down 1/10 of a psi. Nothing critical, but enough to warrant a second look. I tightened the connection at the sensor, just to be sure, and it settled down. Probably just a loose wire. These old systems, they're always something. It's a constant battle against entropy, really. I thought about calling maintenance, but what was I going to tell them? The gauge was wiggling, they'd laugh me off the phone, and honestly, I didn't want to deal with the paperwork. I was heading back toward the pump house when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the radio. I'd left it tuned to a shortwave station out of Germany, a guy talking about weather patterns over the North Sea. But the voice wasn't coming from the speaker. It was softer, more desperate. "Help!" I stopped, listening. It sounded like a woman, distant, muffled, like she was calling from inside a well. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks. Sound carries weirdly out here, especially with everything so dry. The ground is hard as concrete, and there's nothing to break it up. I considered the idea of an animal, maybe a coyote, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. "Help me, please." I started walking towards the sound, automatically. It was coming from the direction of the western perimeter fence, a stretch I hadn't patrolled yet tonight. My rational brain was already constructing scenarios. Someone lost? A hiker wandered off the trail. There's that old logging road a mile or so out that way. People get turned around on it all the time. Stupid tourists. The voice came again, clearer this time. Definitely a woman, definitely in distress. I'm stuck. I picked up my pace, breaking into a jog, my gut clenched. This wasn't a coyote. This wasn't the wind. This was someone who needed help. The fence line was overgrown with weeds and brush, making it hard to see. I pushed through the tangled vegetation, scanning for any sign of anything. Then, I remembered. Not a clear memory, not like recalling a phone number, more like a feeling, a cold knot in my stomach, a fragment of a sentence, something about sounds. Don't investigate. Leave the document. Old Man Hemlock's warnings. It wasn't a coherent thought, just a rising panic, a sense that walking towards that voice was a very bad idea. I tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous. Someone could be seriously injured out there. I was the only one around for miles. What if it was a medical emergency? What if she'd fallen and broken a leg? But the voice, it felt wrong. It didn't sound like normal distress. It was flat, almost mechanical, and it was getting louder, clearer, with every step I took. "Help, I can't move." I stopped dead, my hand reaching for the radio. Maybe I should call it in. Let dispatch handle it, but dispatch would ask questions. They'd want details. They'd want me to go investigate. I remembered something else, a vague impression of the document. Something about the sound getting clearer the closer you get. A lure. It wasn't offering help, it was the problem. I turned around, just spun on my heel, and started walking back the way I came. The voice followed me. It didn't fade, it didn't change, it just accompanied me. Getting louder, more insistent. "Please don't leave me." I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, ignoring the protests of my conscience. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, focusing on the pump house, on the familiar glow of the control panel. The voice trailed off as I entered the perimeter of the station, dissolving into the background hum of the machinery. By the time I reached the pump house, it was gone. I stood there, leaning against the metal siding, gasping for breath. My legs felt like jelly. My palms were slick with sweat. I hadn't run that fast in years. I checked my watch. I'd been gone maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. I looked back towards the fence line, half expecting to see someone standing there, staring at me. But there was nothing. Just the weeds, the brush, and the oppressive darkness. I went back inside, logged the patrol route, and made a note about the fluctuating pressure gauge on Unit 9. I didn't mention the voice. I didn't mention the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I didn't mention the rule I'd vaguely remembered and blindly obeyed. I keep replaying it in my head. What if it was someone who needed help? What if I could have done something? But even as I ask myself those questions, I know the answer. I know with a chilling certainty that walking towards that voice would have been a mistake, a fatal mistake. I'm going to need a stronger cup of coffee, and I think I'm going to start carrying that flashlight. Old Man Hemlock left in the break room. He said it had a special bulb, said it cut through the dark better than anything he'd ever seen. I didn't pay much attention to it before. I do now. The stillness feels different now, too. It's not just quiet, it's waiting. And I have a feeling it's waiting for me. I was calibrating the flow meters on Unit 6. It wasn't a glamorous job, not by any stretch, but it was methodical. Turn the valve, watch the needle, adjust the setting, repeat. The gauges were old, analog, the kind with a satisfying click as you fine-tuned them. Old Man Hemlock had shown me how to do it, grumbling about digital readouts and the soft hands of the younger generation. He'd said you could feel the pressure in your teeth when you got it just right. I hadn't felt anything in my teeth, but I was getting the hang of it. The station was quiet as usual. The pumps thrummed, a low, constant vibration that you eventually stopped noticing. The air smelled of oil and something else, metallic, but not like rust. More like the inside of a battery. I'd gotten used to it. Or I'd stopped thinking about it, which was probably the same thing. I checked my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. I was already thinking about the coffee I'd make when I got home, about collapsing into bed next to Sarah. She'd been sleeping better lately, which was a relief. The medication was finally kicking in, and the pain wasn't quite as relentless. Every little improvement felt like a victory. I finished with Unit 6 and moved on to 7. The readings were a little off here too. The flow rate was consistently lower than it should have been. I started adjusting the valve, listening for that click, watching the needle creep upwards. That's when I noticed it. A rhythmic pulsing sound, not from the pumps, not from the generators, something else. It was faint, almost subliminal, like a heartbeat echoing in a hollow room. I stopped adjusting the valve and listened. It was definitely there, a steady thumping rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I glanced at the control panel, checking for any anomalies, any alarms. Nothing. Everything was within normal parameters. Just the building settling, I muttered to myself. Old pipes, expansion and contraction. That's all it is. I resumed my work, but the pulsing wouldn't leave me alone. It was growing louder, more insistent. And then, I saw the clock on the panel blink. It was 2:23 a.m. And suddenly, something flickered at the edge of my memory. A phrase half-formed, from that ridiculous document Hemlock had made me read on my first day. Something about a time and an action. Something about not missing it. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. It wasn't the cold. The station was well heated. It was something else. I scrolled through the digital log on the control panel looking for anything that might explain the pulsing sound. Nothing. Then I remembered the document, Rule something. I couldn't recall the number or even the exact wording, just the feeling of dread that washed over me when I'd read it. Something about counting, about performing an action, and a specific time. 2:23 a.m. My eyes darted around the pump house, searching for what? I didn't even know. Then I remembered the small maintenance hatch in the floor near Unit 7. It led to a crawl space that ran beneath the pumps. Hemlock had told me it was mostly unused, just for accessing some older wiring. And I remembered, with a sickening lurch, that the document had mentioned tapping. 3 taps. On metal. I stared at the hatch, my hand hovering over it. This was absurd, utterly ridiculous. I was a grown man, a quasi-engineer, and I was about to tap on a metal hatch because some crackpot rulebook told me to. It was fatigue, that was all. The isolation was getting to me. I needed sleep. But the pulsing was getting louder, faster now, and the feeling was overwhelming. A sense of wrongness, of impending doom, that I couldn't shake. I glanced at the clock again. It was 2:24 a.m. I knelt down and lifted the hatch. The crawl space beneath was dark and dusty. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Then, I tapped on the metal hatch frame. Once, twice, 3 times. The pulsing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a moment, listening, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I lowered the hatch and stood up, dusting off my knees. I felt foolish, embarrassed. I'd let some ancient, nonsensical rule dictate my actions. I was being paranoid. But as I turned back to Unit 7, I noticed something. The pressure gauge, which had been stubbornly low just moments before, was now reading perfectly normal. Not just normal, but optimally normal. The needle was steady, unwavering, right in the sweet spot. And then I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual metallic tang. This was different, sweet, cloying, like overripe fruit. It was faint, but definitely there, and it seemed to be coming from the crawl space. I didn't go back to look. I finished calibrating Unit 7, then moved on to Unit 8. I didn't try to rationalize what had happened. I didn't try to explain it away. I knew, with a cold certainty, that the document wasn't just a collection of rambling instructions. It was something else, something real. I checked my watch. It was 4:58 a.m. Only a little over an hour until my shift ended. I was going to need a very strong cup of coffee, and I was going to spend the rest of my days wondering what that smell was, and what I'd prevented by tapping 3 times on a metal hatch in the middle of the night. I think I'm finally starting to believe old man Hemlock wasn't crazy, just prepared. But for what? I don't want to know. The overnight shift was mostly preventative maintenance, checking levels, calibrating sensors, walking the perimeter. Tonight, it was the flow meters in the secondary distribution building, small, brick, and windowless. It smelled like dust and old electrical wiring, a dry, papery scent. Not unpleasant, just old. I'd been through it a dozen times this shift. Each meter reading was within acceptable parameters. It was almost 6 a.m., another hour, and I could go home. Maybe catch a few hours of sleep before Sarah woke up. I double-checked the torque on the housing of meter 4, then moved on to meter 5. It was tucked away in a corner, behind a stack of spare parts, mostly pipes and fittings, all covered in a layer of gray grime. I shone my flashlight on the display, noting the reading. Normal. I reached for my tablet to log it, and that's when I noticed it. A faint rustling sound, like someone breathing. I froze. The building was utterly silent except for the low hum of the pumps in the main facility, a sound I'd become numb to. The rustling came again, a soft, shallow inhale and exhale. It wasn't coming from the pumps. It wasn't coming from me. My first thought was a rat. They got into everything around here despite old man Hemlock's best efforts, but it didn't sound like a rat. It was too regular, too human. I held my breath, straining to hear over the hum. The breathing continued, steady and rhythmic. Definitely not a rat. I told myself it was my imagination. I hadn't slept properly in days, worrying about Sarah, about the bills, about everything. Lack of sleep did strange things to your hearing. I'd heard things on the shortwave radio that weren't there. Static resolving into voices. It was the same thing, just static in my brain. I took a deep breath, deliberately slow, to calm myself, and then I heard it again, clearer this time. The soft, raspy inhale, the gentle exhale. It was definitely coming from inside the room with me. The air felt colder near meter 5, not dramatically so, just a slight chill. I glanced around quickly. Nothing. Just the meters, the tools, the boxes of spare parts. Something flickered at the edge of my memory. Something about empty rooms and breathing. I couldn't quite grasp it. Old man Hemlock's document. That whole thing was a mess of rules and warnings, most of it sounding like the ramblings of a paranoid old man. But there was something, buried deep in the back of my mind, about not reacting to something in a silent room. I tried to take another deep breath, but it caught in my throat. My chest felt tight and constricted. The breathing continued, unhurried, as if whoever or whatever was doing it had all the time in the world. It felt like it was getting closer. Not physically, I didn't see anything moving, but closer, more present. Then it hit me. The document. A rule. Something about breathing and not holding your breath. I couldn't recall the exact phrasing, just the core of it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't react. Just keep breathing. I forced myself to exhale, slow and even. It felt unnatural, like fighting against my own instincts. Every cell in my body wanted to hold my breath, to freeze, to disappear, but I kept breathing, in, out, in, out. I started to back away, slowly and deliberately. Keeping my breathing steady, it was difficult. My lungs felt like they were burning. Each inhale felt shallow and insufficient. I focused on the rhythm, forcing my body to comply, in, out. The breathing persisted, a constant, unnerving counterpoint to my own. It seemed to follow me, remaining at the same distance as if anchored to the space around meter 5. I reached the doorway, then continued backing out into the main corridor. As I walked, I noticed a faint discoloration on the floor near meter 5. A dark patch, almost like a stain. It hadn't been there before. I didn't look at it for long. I kept breathing, in, out. I didn't stop until I was back in the main control room. The hum of the pumps a welcome, familiar sound. I leaned against the console, my chest heaving, trying to regulate my breathing. It took several minutes before it felt normal again. I glanced back towards the secondary distribution building. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Something had changed. I'd obeyed the rule. I'd kept breathing, and I'd gotten out. But the feeling of being watched, of being known, lingered. I looked down at my hands. They weren't trembling, but they felt cold. Not from the temperature, but from something else. A creeping, internal chill. I rubbed them together, trying to generate some warmth. I checked the time. 6:32 a.m. Just under half an hour left. I logged the meter readings, making a note of the slight discoloration on the floor in the secondary distribution building, just in case. I didn't tell anyone about the breathing. What would I even say? I heard someone breathing in an empty room, so I kept breathing back. They'd think I was losing it, and honestly, I was starting to wonder if I was. The thought kept nagging at me. I hadn't just followed a rule. I'd acknowledged something. By remembering the rule, by consciously controlling my breathing, I'd confirmed that whatever was in there was real, and that it was paying attention. I sat at the console, staring at the monitors, listening to the hum of the pumps. I wasn't looking forward to going back in there, even after my shift was over, and I definitely wasn't humming any tunes. Not ever again. The silence, I realized, had been a kindness, a fragile, temporary thing, and I'd just broken it. I was calibrating the flow rate on line 7. It's a tedious job, really. Checking the pressure gauges, adjusting the valves by tiny increments, logging everything in triplicate. But it's a necessary one. Old equipment needs constant attention. The whole place does, really. It felt routine, which after the last few nights was a blessing. The air in the valve house was thick with the smell of oil and something metallic, like warm engine parts. Not unpleasant, exactly, just present. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a smear of grease. The air wasn't hot, maybe 65 degrees, but it felt heavy. I was starting to get that dull ache behind my eyes that meant I hadn't had enough coffee. I double-checked the readings. Everything was within acceptable parameters. Still, I made another micro-adjustment to the valve, just to be sure. The needle on the gauge flickered, then settled. Good. I was starting to think I was getting the hang of this. It wasn't exactly stimulating, but it was a paycheck, and a paycheck with health insurance, that mattered. That's when I smelled it. Not the oil, not the metal, something else. Something sweet. Like overripe fruit, almost cloying. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint undertone to the usual smells of the station. I paused, sniffing the air. Maybe it was coming from my lunch. I'd packed a banana, and maybe it had bruised in my bag. I unzipped my lunch bag, rummaged around. Nope, just a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a slightly squashed sandwich. The sweet smell was still there, though definitely stronger now. It seemed to be coming from down the line, towards the main pumping building. I dismissed it. Probably a leak in the cooling system, some kind of glycol solution maybe. They use those in industrial applications. It wouldn't be dangerous, just a maintenance issue. I made a mental note to report it on the morning shift handover. But the smell kept growing. It wasn't just sweet anymore. There was something else underneath it, something organic, like decaying leaves or damp earth. It was unsettling, but I still tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a problem with the drainage system, something blocked, causing a buildup of something. Then a memory surfaced. Fleeting, blurry. Something I'd skimmed over during my initial training. A document filled with warnings and regulations, something about smells. Don't ignore them. Move upwind. I couldn't recall the specifics, just a nagging feeling of importance. A rule. There had been so many rules. It wasn't the glycol. It wasn't a drainage problem. It was something else. And it was getting closer. I straightened up. My gut tightening. The smell was definitely coming from the pumping building. I glanced towards the main doors, 100 yards down a gravel path. The air above the building seemed distorted, shimmering slightly. It was probably just the heat or the light, but I didn't believe it. That fragment of a rule insisted. Move upwind, immediately. Don't try to figure it out. I turned, abandoning the calibration of line 7. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked, quickly now towards the north side of the facility. The wind was blowing from the south. I kept walking, forcing myself to pick up the pace, even though every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to find the source of the smell. It was a struggle. The smell was intoxicating, compelling. It made me want to lean in, to understand. But the memory of the rule, the weight of all the other strange things that had happened, held me back. As I moved further north, the smell began to dissipate, fading into the background. But it didn't disappear completely. It lingered, a faint sweetness on the back of my throat. I stopped by the perimeter fence, near the emergency access gate. The wind was strong here, carrying the smell away. I leaned against the fence, trying to catch my breath. My hands were clammy. My pulse was erratic. I looked back towards the pumping building. The shimmering was gone. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. Something felt wrong, profoundly wrong, and I'd left line 7 unfinished. The gauges would drift, the pressure could fluctuate. It was a minor infraction, but it felt like a betrayal, a sign of weakness. I knew with a sickening certainty that I hadn't escaped anything. I'd simply acknowledged it. By remembering the rule, by obeying it, I'd confirmed that whatever was creating that smell was aware of me, and that it knew I knew. The silence hadn't been a kindness. It was a test, and I'd failed. I rubbed my arms. Despite the fact that the temperature hadn't changed, that chill I'd felt before, it was back, deeper now, settling into my bones. I checked the time. 7:18 a.m. 12 minutes until shift change. 12 minutes until I could get out of here. 12 minutes until I could pretend this hadn't happened. But I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't be able to pretend. Not anymore. Not after the smell. I needed more coffee. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to start looking for a new job. Even if it meant giving up the health insurance. Even if it meant falling further behind on the bills. Anything was better than this. The east was starting to lighten, a bruised purple bleeding into gray. I was running a diagnostic on the pressure sensors along line 4, the ones that always gave me trouble. They'd drift even after calibration, and I'd have to keep babysitting them. It wasn't a difficult task, just tedious. The kind of thing that made 8 hours feel like 20. I tightened a coupling, checked the readout on my tablet, and made a note to flag it for maintenance during the day shift. It was a temporary fix, at best. The coffee was gone. I'd finished the last of it hours ago, and the thermos was just a cold metallic weight in my hand. I considered making another pot, but the machine was temperamental, and I didn't have the energy to wrestle with it. Besides, shift change was close. I could get a decent cup at the diner in town, maybe even splurge on a slice of pie. Sarah deserved pie. I moved further down the line, the metal cold under my gloved hand. It was quiet, thankfully. The last few nights had been unsettling. The smell was mostly gone, though I kept finding myself sniffing, a nervous habit I hadn't realized I'd developed. I still felt that prickling on my skin, that sense of being watched, but it was faint, manageable. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't the usual static or the dispatch chatter. It was a voice, a woman's voice. Faint, distorted, but undeniably Sarah. "Kieran?" she said, the static almost swallowing her words. "Kieran, can you hear me? I need help." My stomach lurched. I froze, hand still on the pressure sensor. Sarah was at home, asleep. She'd been exhausted all week, still recovering from the last round of treatments. She wouldn't be calling the pumping station. Not at this hour. "Sarah," I said, my voice rough from disuse. I reached for the transmit button, my finger hovering over it. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" The voice crackled again, more insistent now. "Kieran, please. It's cold. I'm scared." The sound of her voice, even garbled as it was enough to short-circuit any rational thought. My hand moved towards the transmit button, almost without conscious control. Then, a flicker of something, a half-formed memory, a document buried in the onboarding paperwork, something about voices, something about not answering. It wasn't clear, I couldn't grasp the specifics, but a feeling, cold and sharp, pierced through the panic. A rule. There was a rule about this. Something about not responding to calls, especially certain kinds of calls. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to dredge up the memory. It was like trying to catch smoke. I remembered the oppressive weight of the document, the small print, the sheer number of rules, and a vague, unsettling sense that ignoring them was far less dangerous than following them. The voice on the radio was pleading now, laced with a desperation that felt agonizingly real. "Kieran, please, don't just stand there. I need you." My hand trembled above the transmit button. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to reassure her, to find out what was happening. But that half-remembered rule held me back. Something about acknowledging something, opening a door. I couldn't remember the exact wording, but the feeling was overwhelming. I forced my hand down, clenching it into a fist. I bit the inside of my cheek, hard enough to taste blood. It felt like a physical violation, like betraying her, but I couldn't risk it. Whatever that document was warning about, it felt significant. The voice on the radio shifted. Losing its frantic edge, it became flat, distant, almost mechanical. "Kieran," it said, the name stretched out, devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have done that." I stumbled back, knocking against the metal piping. The air suddenly felt thick, suffocating. My ears rang. The radio continued to crackle, but the voice was gone, just static. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to check the security cameras, to call Sarah directly on my cell phone. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something told me that any further action would only make things worse. I looked down at my tablet. The pressure reading on line 4 had spiked, way beyond the acceptable range. The alarm hadn't triggered yet, but it would, soon. I hadn't even finished the diagnostic. I'd been so focused on the radio, on the voice on Sarah, that I'd neglected my job. I started to recalibrate the sensor, my hands clumsy and shaking, but the reading wouldn't stabilize. It continued to climb, defying all logic. Every adjustment I made seemed to push it further into the red. I was losing control. The silence pressed in around me, heavier than before. It wasn't the quiet of an empty facility. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of something waiting. I glanced at my watch. 7:32 a.m. 8 minutes until shift change, 8 minutes until I could escape. But I knew with a cold certainty that leaving wouldn't be enough. Something had changed. I hadn't just avoided a mistake. I'd made a choice, and that choice had consequences. I'd always been a rule follower, a good boy. Even when I didn't understand the rules, I obeyed them. It was how I was raised. It was how I survived. But this was different. This felt like a surrender, a sacrifice. I hadn't saved Sarah. I'd sacrificed a piece of myself, and I had the sickening feeling that whatever I'd given up was far more valuable than I realized. The smell, faint but present, now carried a metallic tang, like old blood. The drive home was gray. Not because of the weather, though, it was overcast, but because everything felt muted. The colors hadn't changed, the road hadn't shifted, but my perception had. It was like someone had turned down the saturation on the world. I kept checking the rearview mirror, not for cars, but for nothing. Just a habit formed after 12 hours of feeling watched. Sarah was waiting up, a mug of tea in her hands. She didn't ask about my night, not directly. She knew I wouldn't tell her everything. I'd said it was quiet, a little boring, mostly paperwork. She just held me for a long time, her grip tight. It felt good, grounding, but even that felt different, like I was a fragile thing she was afraid of breaking. I went back to work the next day. To the station had to. Bills don't stop, and the insurance, well, we needed it. I drove around the perimeter fence, just like I'd done 1,000 times before, and my hand instinctively went to the radio dial. I didn't turn it on. I couldn't. I just kept driving. The air was still unnervingly so, even though there was a breeze rustling the dry grass. A bad calm, I thought. Remembering something I hadn't known I remembered. The new supervisor, a man named Hemlock, the one who'd given me the initial instructions, was already there. He barely acknowledged me, just handed over the keys and a clipboard with a new set of diagnostic checks. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago. He didn't ask about the previous shift. He didn't offer any reassurance. He just seemed relieved to be passing it on. I spent the shift going through the motions, checking the gauges, logging the readings, pretending to be focused on the numbers. But my attention kept drifting, to the silence, to the way the shadows lengthened and shifted with the setting sun, to the faint, almost imperceptible scent that clung to the air, something sweet and rotten, even though the wind was coming from the opposite direction. I found myself tapping my fingers on the metal console 3 times, then stopping. Just a nervous habit, I told myself. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the pump engines ticked and whirred, not in unison, but with a slight unsettling offset. The way the security cameras seemed to focus on empty space rather than the perimeter. The way the metal of the control panels felt cold, even on a warm day. I kept checking them, running my hand along the surfaces, needing to feel something solid and real. The shift ended. I handed over the clipboard to the next guy, barely making eye contact. He was young, fresh out of tech school, eager to prove himself. He asked if everything had been normal. I just shrugged. Routine, I said. It felt like a lie, but what was I supposed to say? Back home, I tried to settle into a normal evening. Dinner with Sarah, a little TV reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being off balance. I found myself listening for things, for sounds that weren't there, for whispers in the silence. I kept glancing at my reflection, half expecting to see something else looking back. I've been off the shift for 3 weeks now. I'm back to listening to shortwave, trying to find some normalcy in the static and the distant voices. But the radio feels different now. I don't search for signals anymore. I listen for gaps, for the absence of sound, for the places where voices should be. I applied for a transfer within the company to a different facility, further away. It was denied. Apparently, my skill set is uniquely suited to the remote monitoring position. Sarah doesn't ask about it anymore. She knows. We both do. This morning, while making coffee, I noticed something. The sugar bowl. It's a small ceramic piece, shaped like a bird. It was a gift from my grandmother, and it was facing the wrong way. It always faces towards the window, towards the garden. But this morning, it was turned inward, towards the wall. I corrected it, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been rearranging things while I slept.